Hello everyone. In our earlier presentation on the topic Impact of the French Revolution, we discussed how the three phases of French Revolution influenced the writers of English literature. In this second part of the same topic, that is the impact of French Revolution Part 2, we are going to discuss the influence of the French Revolution on some of the important Romantic poets. So let us see how the French Revolution influenced Wordsworth. The French Revolution was a determining factor of his career. His theory and work as a poet were much influenced by the teachings of Rousseau. It was under this powerful influence that he brought out the most famous work in collaboration with Coleridge, that is the Lyrical Ballads in 1798. According to Palgrave, Lyrical Ballads was a trumpet that heralded the dawn of a new era by making the prophecy that poetry, an unlimitable art of expressing man's inner and deep-seated joys and sorrows, would not be fettered by the narrow and rigid bonds of artificial conventions and make-believe formalism. The lyrical ballads led a revolt against the artificial sentiment and the artificial and mechanical poetic style of the 18th century, that is the neoclassical period. And it also established the truth that poetry, if at all is to remain poetry, must express the feelings and joys and fears of common men and women close to the soil and interpret their day-to-day activities of life. Wordsworth noticed that nature has healing power, and he applied the slogan of Rousseau, "Return to nature." The sense of mystery which led many persons to a remote past was believed by Wordsworth to be capable of satisfaction closer at hand. And Wordsworth found it, instead of the Middle Ages and Greek art, in the simplicities of everyday life, like an ordinary sunset, the clouds, a morning walk over the hills, a cottage girl, and so on. So he turned for the subjects of his poetry to the life of the unsophisticated village folk who lived away from the recognized centers of culture. At the time of Revolution, Wordsworth was a young man of only 19, and during the first phase, he wanted to take active part but was drawn back by his guardian. The French Revolution inspired the democratic feelings and passion of liberty in his heart. In the prelude, he describes how thrilled he was by the occasion. He felt that Europe itself was thrilled with joy, and France was standing at the top of golden hours, and human nature seemed to be born again. So he wrote, quote, "Bliss was it in that dawn to be alive, but to be young was very heaven," unquote. So Wordsworth visited France twice, first in 1790 and then in 1791. But the third phase of the French Revolution shattered his faith in Revolution. He got disturbed by the war between France and England, and his youthful rapture came to an end with the Reign of Terror and the emergence of Napoleon. This sent him in the arms of his first love, that is nature. Thus, he passed through a mental and spiritual crisis, and though he recovered himself finally, yet the influence of the revolution remained as a vital impression on his mind. Ultimately, he became a Tory, and although he continued believing in the dignity of man and applying his poetic faculty to the common objects and the lowest people. Now, it is noteworthy that the best poetic work of Wordsworth was done during the period of his revolutionary fervor. The impact of the French Revolution on Coleridge was of the same pattern as was on Wordsworth, that is, youthful exuberance at the rising of the masses, ending in despair and disillusionment with the Reign of Terror. Coleridge, influenced by the French Revolution, composed the poem Ode on the Departing Year in 1796, and the last poem by Coleridge was also Ode to France. Now, after the disillusionment, Wordsworth and Coleridge followed different paths. Wordsworth sought to nature, whereas Coleridge sought to abstract philosophy and intellectual idealism. Coleridge failed to receive from nature the joy which he was in want of. Metaphysics interested him and claimed his almost full attention. Coleridge's poetic spirit declined with the decline of his revolutionary fervor, and by 1811 he became not only an anti-revolution Tory but also a very bad, that is incorrigible anti-Gallican, that is, he opposed to what is French. Now, on Byron, the French Revolution exerted no direct influence. He was very young to grasp the full significance of the events which followed after Napoleon. He was completely the child of the revolution. He was a revolutionary in his own right. He was against almost all social conventions and institutions and felt pleasure in violating and condemning them with the greatest abandon. In his poetry, he most vigorously championed the cause of social and political liberty and died almost as a martyr in the cause of Greek independence. According to a critic, Byron excelled most other poets of England in his being one of the supreme poets of revolution and liberty. His poetry voices the many moods of the spirit of revolution which captured the imagination of Europe in the early years of the last century. He was a rebel against society, but also against the very conditions of human life, and he is a supreme exponent of some distinctive forces of the revolution. However, there is no trace of its constructive energy, its social ardor, and its utopianism in his work. He was excited by the imposing personality of Napoleon, who appealed to him as a Byronic hero. So, when Shelley started writing, the French Revolution had already become a historical incident, that is, a thing of the past. However, the spirit of revolution breathes vigorously in his poetry. After his characteristic way, he overlooked physical realities and was attracted by abstractions only. He was influenced by the ideologic aspects, and as Crompton and Ricketts says, that ideas inspired him, not episodes. And so he drank in the doctrines of Godwin. To Shelley, the revolution appealed as an idea, not as a concrete historical fact. He revolted against old customs, traditions, conventions, and institutions, and he aspired ideals of love, beauty, and liberty. His important poems, such as The Revolt of Islam, Queen Mab, Prometheus Unbound, and the incomparable Ode to the West Wind, breathes a revolutionary spirit, impatient of all curbs and keenly desirous of the emancipation of man from all kinds of shackles, political, social, and even moral. Love and liberty are the two ruling principles in Shelley's hierarchy of values, and in his exaltation of them both, he comes very near to Rousseau. Shelley always envisioned ahead a real revolution which would rectify all wrongs once and for all. Now, this hope for the millennium is the central theme of much of his poetry. Now, Keats was almost entirely untouched by the French Revolution, as by everything earthly, and according to a critic in the Judgment of Philosophy, politics and ethics were not suitable subjects for verse. So while Coleridge and Wordsworth were reflecting upon the moral laws of the universe, while Byron was voicing the political ideas of Europe in the poetry of revolt, and Shelley was writing of an enfranchised humanity. The music of Keats luxuriated in classical myths and medieval legends, and was inspired by an insatiable love of beauty. So, from a study of Keats' poetry, it is hard to believe that such an incident as the French Revolution ever took place at all. So, this is how the French Revolution influenced these romantic poets.